never had someone plainly say to me, please ban me, daddy, I'm gonna end up making everyone sad, which is essentially what that ramble was. And I hate it so much. Why can't we all just get along?
I wish I could just knit a sweater for everybody to share.
There we go. But I think we can go ahead and actually just start having a conversation around this section, even with just a handful of us. Nazarene and JK, please, as we go, type in the chat that you have a question or a comment. You too, Shahid. Just if you have a comment or question on this section or as we're talking, don't hesitate. I'll make sure I make time. This is a more laid back room overall. This is just really discussing the section, getting in deep, getting in and making sure people grasp some of the concepts, the things sort of said and how it's said. And because there's a lot said inside of this section that's incredibly important. So, but with that, I do have to do my intro because we, in theory, have a podcast that I'm supposed to be editing and uploading, which I've been lax on again, but I will get back to it. Thank all of you for joining us today at the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collection's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. Today we are going to do a full review of the Civilized Capitalist Machine, section 3.9. As always, if you like what we're doing, you can follow us on Twitter for the one reply tweet or occasional quote tweet. I hate Twitter. Or you can support us on Patreon because every dollar helps. We have weird bots and costs that go with running all of this stuff. And we're at Patreon DGQC. As I said today, we're going to be going over the Civilized Capitalist Machine, which is an incredibly important chapter before we move into how capitalist representation has changed. Very specifically, we're going to be dividing this not into a discussion directly of how representation works, because that is coming next, and we're going to do our best to sort of kick that off and kick that can down the road to the next reading. But much more about how production and anti-production is organized inside of the society, which is, to me, really the brunt of this section. This conversation around what organizes, or how does it organize? What is the capitalist machine? How does it place the organs around each other, the order of them? How does it create production and produce itself? The methods of the inside of this section are incredibly complicated. It's a lot to take in, but to me, that's the brunt of the idea that they're trying to get at here. So anything around that, feel free to jump in the chat, say, hey, I have a question here, or if you hear a lull of silence, which I love to leave, don't hesitate to say, hey, I have a question. I'm happy to not let anyone know your name if you want to stay anonymous. We're generally pretty good about that. Where do you think we should start, though, today, Jack?
I mean, I usually do things sequentially, so I guess
the birth of it is. Like, it's the birth of the state.
Right. If nobody has any preliminary questions.
Yeah, I think we just move straight into the birth of the state, because it's what they open with. We've been going over the course of chapter 3 through the sociuses, whatever the plural of that might be. We start with the primitive, which is a sort of commune-style anarcho-communist life, where our filiative line, which is I give birth to children, my family, the filiative line, and the alliant line, the people who I spend my time with and I do exchanges with and I'm sort of dealing with in my tribe, but I don't directly give birth to. My needs are met along those two lines, and how they begin to intersect. The filial line, when I have a daughter, I use that to create alliant lines. She is the mechanism of such a thing. My son as well, bringing in daughters from other families. This back and forth as well as the way that desire is marked upon us. And we're not going to get to representation specifically, but these are the elements of the primitive machine and how it organizes us, how it tells me what my desires need to be. And it's a very imminent, very specific line. I am doing what I'm doing because of those immediately around me, right next to me, up against me. It is to sort of mix thinkers. It's up against the real. My desire is that. It's not some symbolic thing or attached to any of that. It's right there. That gets sort of taken over by a despot, specifically the despotic state. The despotic state comes in and says, oh yes, your filial and alliant lines, both of them come through me. I am the Pharaoh, I am Caesar, I am God, I am the father of all, or the mother of all, depending, but I am the one that everything is owed to. As such, all my filial and alliant lines, the things that were determining where I was putting my energies before, get redirected, and that redirection happens through the despot. And the despot's able to organize at what we might call a meta layer of society. I can look out over my kingdom and I can go, oh yes, these people, they're the ones who are going to build rocks. These guys are over here. They're the ones who are going to carve them. And this group over here is going to build the pyramid or the temple. And I can sort of be at that 1,000,000-foot view of all of it and order them around, give that larger setup, their reference to Marx's Asiatic production is, I think, appropriate to bring up. Beyond that, we move into the civilized capitalist machine, and I will read the beginning of this section because I think it'll say it better than I can, and we can break it down a little bit. The first great movement of deterritorialization appears with the overcoding performed by the despotic state, but it is nothing compared to the other great. Sorry, I've been having mic troubles. But it is nothing compared to the other great movement, the one that will be brought about by the decoding of flows. The action of decoded flows is not enough, however, to cause the new break to traverse and transform the socius. Not enough, that is, to induce the birth of capitalism. Decoded flows strike the despotic state with latency. They submerge the tyrant, but they also cause him to return in unexpected forms. They democratize him, oligarchize him, segmentalize him, monarchize him, and always internalize and spiritualize him, while on the horizon there is the latent Urstadt, for the loss of which there is no consolation. It is now up to the state to recode as best it can, by means of regular or exceptional operations, the product of the decoded flows. Let us take an example of Rome, the decoding of the landed flows through the privatization of property, the decoding of monetary flows through the formation of great fortunes, the decoding of the commercial flows through the development of commodity production, the decoding of the producers through expropriation and proletarization. All the preconditions are present, everything is given without producing a capitalism, properly speaking, but rather a regime based on slavery. And this goes on for some time. This opening is again getting to this the underlying point I was trying to come through here, that there isn't a sea change that happens, and it isn't that there's all these points that we've discussed that are capital, or Marx discussed, the proletarians or commodification or private land. These aren't the things that bring about capital. There's some other things that make capitalism exist, and these pieces have been created and formed and dropped off and fallen off through a universal history, a genealogy of time, and a genealogy of the socius, as we're able to see pieces pick up and drop off, ultimately coming to where we're at really today, which is that of the capitalist socius. And the way that the capitalist socius works very specific to the entire thing. And we can get into that in a moment. But I wanted to start with the birth of it and sort of a genealogy to it. Jack, does that work? Please add.
Yeah, thank you for kicking that off. And that really is where they start off a section, right? It's a question of how capitalism, right? Because capitalism isn't necessarily a telos, right? So how does the despotic how does the despotic lead into capitalism, right? And just like you're saying, one of the big things they're stressing here is that because the despotic, one of the challenging things I think is that there's a temptation to understand it in kind of a Sartrean manner of conscious choice making. And that's the interesting thing about Deleuze and Guattari, right? The despotic machine, the despotic socius, right? This kind of BWO of it all. These aren't conscious decisions that are happening. This is all unconscious production upon the surface of the body of the despot, which is ultimately the body of the entire organization, right? All the ways in which that coordinates in connection is what they're getting at, which is an interesting way to think about not only despotism, but larger concerns like ethics and fascism. What do you do when that's producing you? You're in those forms of production. And so then to make a final point, just like Brooks was reading, so right, the despotic doesn't just have to, and Rome is actually a phenomenal example, just like Greece. The despotic doesn't have to look the same way. It doesn't have to be one person any more than it has to be democracy or oligarchy. The ways in which those are produced, right? The things that produce the democracies of Rome as much as the oligarchies of Rome. That is what constitutes the despotic, which is going to be not only the socius, but the Erstat, which means you're ultimately talking about a process of, on the one hand, classic Deleuze and Guattari, right? On the one hand, overcoding processes from the despotic, right? And then on the other hand, the Erstat's use of recoding, right? So as flows are being overcoded and there's this problem of decoded flows, because not only are you dealing with the socius that's overwriting the primitive socius, the primitive codes and those flows, but in the process decoding is happening. And now the socius has to deal with not only what it's overcoding and sort of imbricating, but what's becoming decoded. And the Erstat is part of that recoding process, right? And ultimately, that's going to help produce not only the transformations that we see from oligarchy to democracy to monarchy and so forth, but that's going to play into what makes I shouldn't say capitalism per se, what makes capital as socius possible.
And I would add one of their lines here that I really love, and it's a thing that they go through quite a bit, is the line of the commodification of land, these elements. One of the things that also did exist for 3,000 years before capitalism is money. Money itself as an abstraction of the exchange value of property. The dynamism of money itself, actually, they account for in the previous chapters. Because money can, inflate or deflate, but because of how the despotic works, they're able to simply overcode anything like that. It's not a decoding of desire. It's not a decoding of value. It's not a decoding of elements, but almost itself an overcoding if there's ever any trouble with the way that capital or money can work, which puts it in a different place than capital, which we'll get to significantly. But again, the idea of money being the part of capital or any of these elements goes with commodified land, goes with any of these other things that they've mentioned, which are, yes, we have as trappings of capitalism, but it's not the part of capitalism that makes capitalism capitalism. These are all pieces that have come before, but why didn't we have capitalism as we know it? The line, please go ahead.
I want to ask the question: is the Erstat another form of the despotic? I mean, what's the difference between Erstat and the despotic?
So the Erstat is the state apparatus and machine.
Okay.
The section on this is kind of tough to pull it apart from the despotic, but it's a specific way of operation and sort of the background machinery of how the state works and exerts its power. So it's called the Erstat, sort of after old state apparatuses that existed in like Babylon and things like that, with this idea of you have this central bureaucracy, and as such this is the thing where power is sort of exercised, but it's also a shape that we've not lost since then, that there is almost a singular style that all states have taken on since. The nature of Greece to America to Germany under Nazi rule, they're not like wildly different states. They're kind of the same. They do different shit, produce different things, varying styles of it, but the machinery of it isn't unrecognizable to each other. As such, if we think about the way that the state functions underneath that, the Earth state sort of sits in the background, changes form, but sits there and sort of waits for the next way it needs to work. The phrasing that they have here that I really like, one sec, let me go back to it. The state's job essentially is to recode as best it can by means of regular or exceptional operations. These are the product of decoded flows, the recoding of the decoding. The state is there to basically maintain a stability with an eye towards, I don't know. We had a long series of debates on this that I'm happy to have at some point again, but no matter what, there is this latent Urstaat that's sitting there, no matter if it's an oligarchy, a monarchy, a dictatorship, whatever it may be, the state is there and it's very ready to adjust as it needs.
So it's the Urstaat is always characterized by a despotic element, right?
Yes.
Well, it's always sitting in the it's always there. There's a spot that's in the Urstaat. The Urstaat is a kind of a structure, and then there's the Urstaat. The despot is really the king or the queen or whatever, some dominating authority, right?
So to me, and Jack or anyone can probably disagree with this. I still my thoughts on it are that it operates very much in the same way that Oedipus operates for the human subject, and operates on it. That Oedipus isn't a thing. It's a machine that resegmentalizes, changes up my flows and recodes them in terms of mommy, daddy, me, everything that comes through that. But it's not the top of the pile, nor is it the bottom, and it can adjust as it needs. The nature of Oedipus sort of over time shifting. As such, the state operates very much the same way, where it is the thing that also is sort of sitting there and helps reify and change certain elements to be very much in line with this expectation and a push towards a very specific type of representation overall. With the case of the Urstaat overall, and there's not a ton of secondary writing on it, so I think there's a lot of room to interpret here, and I'd love to hear if anyone else has other interpretations. But the nature of the Urstaat is sort of sitting there and being that way, that things get ultimately changed and recoded into what the state can use. I'll leave it awkwardly open for a moment because I think it's worth a response and a conversation there.
So the breakdown of codes is a kind of is a process of decoding.
Yeah. So, and that's where this section is opening up, right? The first great deterritorialization. So the deterritorialization of the primitive by the despotic. And then there'll be the second great deterritorialization, which is that of the despotic from the capital as socius.
Right.
Yeah, like a state's job is to essentially take anything uncoded and completely code it, like totally. There, if on the one side we have like pure schizo free flux, on the other side we have the code that is created by the Urstaat. I think the phrase is, it is the eternal model of everything the state wants to be and desires.
Yeah, I mean, they're taking their cue from sort of a Jungian archetype, right? But this is a very special qualification on that, because this isn't like an archetype representing what it is you desire. This is actually a machine that is basically involved in the codification of desires, right? Very specifically involved in the second synthesis. But at the same time, it's not the full picture, because the despotic socius is still actually performing a lot of the work, and I believe that's what actually falls back on production. But of course, they work together, even though there's a lot of tension between them. For instance, right, as codes are being decoded or overcoded, right, there is this tension for the erstat in the recoding processes, right? So you have, and this is important too, because not only is that the first great deterritorialization, but that's going to play into the second great deterritorialization.
Did that help, JK?
To tack on to that, if it helps too, one of the big differences between the two, everything happens on the full body of the despot. So the entire coordination of the relationships, right, in right, kind of the overall assemblage, say in a society, everything that happens upon that is upon the body of the despotic. So the erstat is affecting what's upon that body, right? But it is not that body itself. It is not the full body of the despot, but it is involved in the second synthesis directly.
Yeah, thanks. We could think of these flows that, decoding and coding of flows as a kind of the series of a process of different series, conjunctive, connective, and disjunctive, and so forth. As like it was discussed in the other book, Logic of Sense, right?
I believe so. The way that fluxes can sort of be thought through here, and the word flows, when they use the word flows, fluxes and flows, I think, are fairly, we'll say, exchangeable. You can swap them out, I think, fairly freely, as long as you keep sort of the way you're cognizing them a little bit in line. But what we're talking about is, as the subject, as we talked about through all of chapter 1 and 2, we have the subject that their desiring machines are essentially producing and utilizing fluxes through their three syntheses. At some point, the subject's created, and out the other side becomes production. Desire essentially being the brunt of this, and also the flux that sort of underlies it. As you have many people together in a society that are doing these same kinds of things, the operation doesn't shift drastically. Instead, now it's focused off of one single person rather than maybe a desiring machine. But now you have hundreds, millions, a billion or two of these people, and their desire flows are now moving outwards. As such, the question is, what have they produced? What is it coded as? And are we decoding it? Within the despot's completely able to sort of take this over and really enjoy it and have everything directed to them. All debts are ultimately for the despot. All work is done for the despot, for king and country, for Caesar, for the pharaoh. The satisfaction is done there. The flux is... Sorry, go ahead, JK.
Yeah, I was gonna. Yeah, so you think of the despot or that as a kind of a master signifier, right?
It would be a way to think through it, as long as we're only talking about production. They aren't necessarily owed the same type of control over all the symbolic. It's not quite the same setup. It's close to Lacan's setup. It's close, and I think there's a little bit of crossover if we were to get into it, but I don't think it's a one-to-one. Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say it's not a master signifier, because the Erstat's not representing the subject. Where you could tie some of that in is between the paralogisms, which does involve S1, right? That which would be involved in the paralogism, whatever signifier in the signifying chain would be, and usually it's the phallus, right? But what would ever become S1, there could be a relationship with the Erstat in that process of coding, but we would still have to fall back on the paralogism to explain it. So you wouldn't have the Erstat actually being S1. You may have it involved in a process that produces S1 though. That could be possible. But no, the Erstat and S1 are not the same thing.
When we talk, sorry, go ahead, JK. Sorry.
No, that's just yeah. Thanks.
As we start to move forward through the way that they're talking about the Erstat and the move into the way fluxes and desires are decoded, we have to also remember that decoding of desires is not unique to capital either. It's a thing that has existed sort of throughout time as well, that the decoding of desires has happened. As they say, a desire that instead of just dreaming or lacking it, produces a desiring machine that is at the same time social and technical. That is why capitalism and its break are defined not solely by decoded flows, but by the generalized decoding of flows, the new massive deterritorialization. It's not uncommon through all of time and all of history for us to find places where certain things get decoded at some point or another and run wild. Guattari talks about this greatly in The Accursed Share, the way that you can have an overabundance or a sort of an explosive side. These things happen. It's not so much that. This is about the fact that all desires become decoded. All flows, all fluxes happen at this massive deterritorialization, and that there is this conjunction overall of deterritorialized flows. To quote, "It is the singular nature of this conjunction that ensured the universality of capitalism. By simplifying a lot, we can say that the savage territorial machine operated on the basis of connections of production, and that the barbarian despotic machine was based on disjunctions of inscription derived from the immanent unity. But the capitalist machine, the civilized machine, will first establish itself on the conjunction. When this occurs, the conjunction no longer merely designates remnants that have escaped coding, or consummation consumptions, as in the primitive feasts, or even the maximum consumption of the extravagance of the despot and his agents. When the conjunction moves to the fore in the social machine, it seems, on the contrary, that it ceases to be tied to enjoyment or to the excess consumption of a class, that it makes luxury itself into a means of investment and reduces all the decoded flows to production in a production for production's sake that rediscovers the primitive connections of labor on condition, the sole condition, that they be linked to capital and to the new deterritorialized full body, the true consumer, from whence they seem to emanate." The shift here as we move to capital, just what they've just gone through, and it's a big deal, is again talking through all of these different varying points that we know have happened in the past that Marx and others have talked about very specifically as key moments of capital. You'll see very often, especially in theory Twitter or left Twitter, whatever the fuck you want to call it, where people dive on any of these. Oh, this is the thing that's the core of capital. And Deleuze and Guattari decidedly take a stance against that there is another element, that at the beginning of things, it's the nature of capital itself is the moment that all these things become decoded, and that all of them become decoded as such, that they become reduced from what they are and fully abstracted. And that's the sort of shift as we move into a different way of thinking about it. We have on the one side, to go to the next paragraph, they're playing with Marx in a very clever way. On the one side, you have the deterritorialized worker who has become free and naked, having to sell labor. On the other, decoded money that has become capital and is capable of buying it. The fact that these two elements result from the segmentation of the despotic state in feudalism and from the decomposition of the feudal state itself and that of its state still does not give us the extrinsic conjunction of these flows. We aren't talking just simply about the moment of labor and capital and the creation of these things. There is a completely different shift in how all things are coded and how all things become decoded. Sorry for the little bit of a ramble. I wanted to keep us moving a little bit so we don't spend 6 hours on this. But Jack, anyone, thoughts, comments as we move to that position?
Yeah, I do have one. I wrote this a few weeks ago, and it was about the passage you just quoted, because it hit me, and then I read this passage, like, oh wow, and no wonder it hit me. I've been here before. There's this, and maybe I glossed over it in my first few readings, but perhaps it's a subtle point, perhaps it's an obvious point. But in that passage, one of the points they're making, and they're qualifying this, pointing out, right, there's a risk of oversimplifying here. Please don't, please don't univocate what we're about to say, but we're trying to make a point about the focus of these three socii and what's changing, right? And that focus is going to be the three syntheses and the three socii. And the point that they're qualifying is, we're not trying to say the first synthesis is exclusive to the primitive, nor is it like the stage of the show. But if we focus for a moment, right, and we take this as kind of a case in point, a lot of what's going on in that first synthesis, or excuse me, that first socius, can be understood very directly in relation to that first synthesis as a priority, meaning that the primitive is very concerned with organization and connection, right? The process of production, in mainly the first stage, the libidinal stage, that first synthesis. The despotic is going to move us to a concern for the second synthesis, which is why we're talking so much about coding. And that's, again, to qualify it, obviously the primitive is concerned about the terror, or the concern, if nothing else, for decoded flows. That's not exclusive to any socius, right? That remains a problem. But in the despotic, the recording process, the second synthesis, the falling back on production, is going to take a little bit more of the focus during the despotic, which means we're talking about, recording processes and memory more directly. So, right, if we go back to the affiliated and alliant, how are flows being coded in that, but also how does that coding produce where those flows go, right? If you go all the way back to the primitive, where they're talking about Levi-Strauss and Leibniz, this is that whole plus minus thing. How do the aligned and affiliated lead into the way that coordination plays into the direction of flows, whether it's their blockage, their splitting, or the emission. And that's going to push us now into the third socius, capital. And this is a really interesting move. And like I said, it hit me this read through, even though looking back, it was actually quite obvious. But I'm a slow learner. The third synthesis, then, in the production of subjectivity through the consummation and consumption of the process of production, right? Voluptas, intensities, and that more directly related to subjectivity, is going to be the more direct concern for the third socius, which makes sense when you think about a lot of the contemporary thinkers at this time are highly concerned with subjectivity, right? And that's kind of what that last bit Brooks was reading is about. There's something happening at the conjunct that is getting into the so that's what it was. And that is really interesting, because I think that helps position a lot of what's going on in capital as socius, without excluding the other two syntheses, right? Those still matter and materially, but it helps us understand that a lot of the focus right now is going to be with the gravitas of that third synthesis, with the production of subjectivity following the other two phases of production.
Yeah, the shift in how commercial money sort of operates in the conjunct there. I love Holland gives a really interesting sort of take on the entire thing as well. I'd recommend reading it. He starts hitting this around, I want to say what page is this of his? 82. And the PDF is elsewhere if you want to find it. It's not super difficult to get. But this conjunct, this moment, is the thing they keep focusing on. The switch, I think the first thing they talk about is there has to be two times. There's a time where land costs very little because there's so much of it. The disintegration of the feudal system, the movement from one person owning everything to suddenly everyone able to own things. As such, property would be very cheap, and then suddenly the property becomes sold. There's a rise in prices, and under conditions that make industrial investment advantageous, in parentheses, the price revolution, an abundant reserve supply of labor, the formation of a proletariat, easy access to raw materials, favorable conditions for the production of tools and machinery. All sorts of contingent factors favor these conjunctions. So many encounters for the formation of the thing, the unnameable. But the effect of the conjunction is indeed capital's tighter and tighter control over production. Capitalism, or its break, the conjunction of all the decoded and deterritorialized flows, cannot be defined by commercial capital or financial capital. These things being merely flows among other flows and elements among other elements, but rather industrial capital. And the very big focus on industrial capital is sort of aiming straight at Marx and talking through the setup, because prior to all of this, my desires could be handled through a directly affiliative line granted through the despot or through family. But suddenly when I'm no longer my desires are no longer just sort of a thing that haphazardly go, oh, you need X, here, pay money. I think of the example that they use that I really enjoy is the merchant capitalist that made profits through exchange by buying cheap in one place and selling dear in another. This depended on independent localities and differences between price structures. To quote Holland, Deleuze and Guattari consider this an alliance form of capital since it operates laterally, this secondary shift, but it's still not the core function of what makes capitalism capitalism. The great transformation occurs, to continue to quote Holland, Deleuze and Guattari agree with Marx, when abstract labor takes on real, practical existence with the commodification of labor power. In schizoanalytic terms, capital becomes filiative. Before that, the exchange value of commercial money represents a mere abstraction projected by the exchange relation itself. Its potential dynamism could be contained by overcoding. Once industrial capital and commodified labor power emerge, exchange relations cease being open-ended, haphazard. Value circulates through its various moments. Money, commodities, means of production, labor power, without leaving the sphere of social production or ceasing to be value. At the same time that the open-endedness of merchant capital gets subsumed by this completely integrated circuit of value, labor power produces a surplus value from within it, from within what is now a self-contained, fully economic system, and industrial capital becomes the new socius at its center. It's a really crisp way of talking through, I think, Jack, what you were talking through as well.
Well, Jack mentioned the subject, right? And when you talk about the subject in the third socius, that's a special form of a subject, right? Defined by alienation, right? So in the other two socius, there is no subject, or there is a kind of a different kind of subject.
Go for it, Jack.
Yeah. So, and that's good that you're bringing up, questions like alienation, am I right? Because we're we are engaging Marxism, right? But we're engaging Marxism from Deleuze and Guattari's perspective. And so there's always going to be subjectivity in the socii, right? That's why I emphasize that qualification they're making. Just because we're focusing on the first synthesis and the primitive doesn't mean the other two don't matter. They matter a lot. But we want to talk about connection for a minute, right? So we're oversimplifying to make a point, as they point out. So in all three socii, yes, you've got the third synthesis producing the conjunct. You have subjectivity, the hunter that we always talk about. There's a subjectivity there in that performance, right? And that relies on the other two syntheses for that process of production, for there to be that final, so that's what it was. So in terms of alienation, they might get into that elsewhere. I think the bit that might be helpful here is where they write, let me see here. So there's this point, okay. This is page 234 leading to 235. This is a ridiculously long sentence, so bear with me. When the conjunction moves to the fore in the social machine, it seems on the contrary that it ceases to be tied to enjoyment or to the excess consumption of the class, that it makes luxury itself into a means of investment and reduces all the decoded flows to production, and a so-called production for production's sake that rediscovers the primitive connections of labor, on the sole condition, that they be linked to capital and to the new deterritorialized full body, the true consumer form, whence they seem to emanate, as in the past with the devil that Marx describes, the industrial unit. So it's your fault if. And I think that kind of helps too, because perhaps we can talk about alienation, but there's this point about subjectivity in that, right? So typically alienation can be understood as I'll borrow kind of Foucault on it, the disadulation of the real man, right? There's this problem by which the person is alienated from their labor, alienated from their essence, is really what it's getting at, right? And one way to understand that is it's a problem of restoring that person with respect to the alienation, putting them back into relation with their labor or with what they're producing, so that there's that this stuff isn't basically denuding them, right? There's not this distance, to put it maybe in a nutshell. I think what Deleuze and Guattari are saying is, well, are you alienated from your desire, right? Because desires produce you, right? So this is one of the first big moves, right? Because it's not a question of consciousness, which will be where Sartre will kind of bring in phenomenology, right? There's this concern for how do we understand these questions in a phenomenological way. Valuable work, but that's not what Deleuze and Guattari are after. Because if desire is coded as labor, and that's what's producing you, right, and your subjectivity is dependent on that, maybe alienation is not the right idea. Maybe it's what they continue with in the next sentence. I'll read it to you, this last one. At the heart of capital, Marx points to the encounter of two so-called principal elements. On one side, the deterritorialized worker has become free and naked, having to sell his labor capacity. So right there, right, we've got not alienation, but deterritorialization. We've got the subjects, right? So organizations happening, recordings happening, and now we've got those subjects with the capacity for labor, meaning that there's a desiring production happening that at the same time comes with their deterritorialization. So they're remakeable here, to put it simply. And on the other, they continue, decoded money that has become capital and is capable of buying it. So right on the other hand, you've got, and this is where you're getting your full body of capital here. Now you've got things happening upon the surface of capital associates. whereby the direction of flows, the recording process, the way it falls back on production, and therefore how it's going to produce subjectivity is being implicated. So it takes us, I think, and that doesn't mean alienation's bourgeois, um, but it does mean that I think they're focusing more on this process of deterritorialization, because the subject, if you're going to talk about production for production's sake, which I think they put in air quotes for probably a very obvious reason, we're talking about the subject constantly being produced in the system, right? And the worker constantly being not only deterritorialized, but re-territorialized. I think here of like today's, like following Peter Drucker, you have to manage yourself. The person today uh, can't expect to be at the same business forever,
Well,
constantly shifting jobs.
the
But even in
line
the old days, this would have applied.
the line of learn to code, which is very common. Like I think it was said during the Bush and then the Obama years for coal miners who lost their work. It's like, cool, learn to code. We can teach you to code. It's the shift of what you do, why you do it, and what the abstract value is of it is this change, this deep decoding into the nature of all of it. And it's because, as Jack was saying, we've got this new way that things become valued. And the alienation, again, is not necessarily that of the subject, but it's the manipulation of desire, or the way that desire now has its filiative being explored through capital, instead of through purely like an alliant. I would spend money to create, enjoinder some guy to mow my lawn. But the change happens where suddenly it's, I'm paying a guy $100 and he's getting 20 surplus dollars through this. Now he's able to put all of that as an investment into a secondary business like an industrial capitalist. The entire thing now is capital, and the money has begotten money. Value has created value. It's become filiative. It's a very different reality when the necessity of what we create is determined by these completely decoded flows, and we're having to do things for this value that's deeply complicated, we'll say, because I don't want to get into the paragraph or two on calculus. But sorry to interrupt, Jack. I just really wanted to bring up that example.
Well, and that's actually where we would have to go into that paragraph, because affiliated and alliant are reconstituted through capital, right? Just in the way that the new alliance and the extended affiliation are reconstituted, reconfigured in despotic, right? But that is exactly what we're getting at. Is so one way to take that passage I just read is, right, the organizations, and this is, the Drucker thing is a very molar way to look at it, because everything you do would be in this process of production. It's not just your job, it's what you're actually doing in every instance, right? It's not actually at that molar of a level, but that's at least makes the point. So, right, we're talking about the way in which the organs, the desiring machines, are reconstituted here as the naked laborer, right? Just to make the point, right? The deterritorialized worker, free and naked, having to sell his labor capacity, right? You can see right there that we're talking about that first synthesis, and we're talking about a way in which there is, right, having to sell his labor capacity, that capacity, right there. That's that tension from 1.1, where you can almost hear that breaking into the or rather the attempt to break into the body without organs, right there, where all of a sudden, where the socius is getting involved and falling back on production, which is exactly where they go with the next part, right? Which is the decoded money become capital, capable of buying it. So already you've got your affiliated and alliant right there, without going into the calculus, because none of us are good Leibnizians. But too, right? So I just called out the first and second syntheses. So then you have your conjunct, which is exactly what we're getting at with the production of voluptas here.
Yeah, and the conjunct, again, coming back to it and the movement of that, the shift. When we start talking about how the subject plays in this, once upon a time, we could have had a discussion around some people being producers or not. I think they get into this a little bit later, so I'll avoid getting too deep. But instead, we need to be talking now about the forces, the flows that enable abstract production in the form of this capital and how it works, and how value begets value, and the way that these things ultimately become concrete in this conjunction, the way that these things sort of become those coded moments. It means that we don't really have a subject who does, or is very necessary, I suppose. The joke being these days, Elon Musk probably does about as much work as the bum on the corner who we let be homeless and we don't mind. In terms of actual production, like actual things that they're doing, probably equal. Maybe even the homeless man may do more. But the way capital's flowing around them, the way that it works, the way that money begets money and accumulates, that plays between exchange money and credit money, the way that banks work within both of them. To quote the next sentence, in credit money, which comprises all commercial and bank credits, purely commercial credit has its roots in simple circulation where money develops as means of payment. Inversely, bank credit affects a demonetization or dematerialization of money and is based on the circulation of drafts instead of the circulation of money. This credit money traverses a particular circuit where it assumes, then loses its value as an instrument of exchange, and where the conditions of flux imply conditions of reflux, giving to the infinite debt its capitalist form. But the state, as a regulator, ensures a principle of convertibility of this credit money, either directly by tying it to gold or indirectly through a mode of centralization that comprises a guarantor of the credit. This is how we're able to have a discussion where Elon Musk or these absurd billionaires who are worth $150, $200 billion, and we're looking at possibly becoming trillionaires in my lifetime, which hurts my heart so hard, are able to do that. But they don't have like a Scrooge McDuck vault. They have this in these flows of capital, in the way that this investment and bank credit sort of works between things. It's not a giant pile of money that they have, but they're able to make the exchange as necessary. And so the money that I earn in my paycheck or through our Patreon here, or that you may get as a gift from a grandmother who sends you $50, the money is somehow valued or labeled the same value as that same dollar that Jeff Bezos has, despite operating drastically differently.
Yeah, I mean it's the Richard Wolff. I mean it's not really a joke, but it is kind of a joke, right? Bezos has more wealth than the continent of Africa almost. How do you square that? But this is their big point too, right? It's not even about them having the wealth per se. It's about the way in which capital actually produces, and especially since we're focusing on subjectivity in the conjunct. But it's the way in which capital actually produces all of this. Because when you think about Elon Musk, right, we can talk about the way in which what he says affects what's going on in, say, the stock market. And there's a way in which we can talk about information theory and Stiglitz. But if we apply Deleuze and Guattari, there's something going on in terms of desire, not just simply information. Because what can be understood there then is these communications, these signifying chains, are part of a production process of production. And what Musk is actually doing, and again, this isn't conscious, this is all unconscious production. What Musk is actually doing, regardless of his self-knowledge, is producing subjectivities in relation to capital that are actually redirecting flows, right? And those are in turn producing in the coordination process, right? So when he talks about how poor Dogecoin is, an easy point in case to make the remark clear is he's affecting the subjectivity, and that subjectivity is a result of the relationships which have been affected, but also more directly a focus here as opposed to simply the information of what he's saying. what he's actually saying is changing the way in which desire is organizing and producing.
Well, his answer to Marx, I mean, one of the sadnesses for those of us who've gotten deep into Deleuze is that his, in theory, last book he was working on or starting was Deleuze reading Marx. And it never got finished, sadly, or started significantly. But this next paragraph, as he starts talking about the key contribution of Keynes, is the reintroduction of desire into the problem of money. It is this that must be subjected to Marxist analysis. This is why it is unfortunate that Marxist economists too often dwell on considerations concerning the mode of production and on the theory of money as a general equivalent as found in the first section of Capital, without attaching enough importance to banking practice, to financial operations, and to the specific circulation of credit money, which would be the meaning of a return to Marx, to a Marxist theory of money. And this dualism they then dive into pretty significantly. And sort of as we were talking about this shift between the way that we have our pay and then they have their industrial capital on the other side. And this shift enables capital and money to be whatever it needs to be and to actually create itself, to have value generate itself, which is a terrifying thing, to say the least.
Well, this is also one of the difficulties, right? Yeah, this is definitely not the kind of thing I want to live in, right, where everything is capital. But at the same time, I want to live in that world because that's the world that produces me. And that's kind of that at least is the upshot of this section is, yeah, there are a lot of problems with this, but the way out of capital is going to be through capital. And that's kind of, I think, interesting because Deleuze and Guattari get some bad press for that because it looks like they're kind of fanboying it. I don't think that's their point, right? They're like Nietzsche; they're not playing good and evil, but they are concerned with if this is what's producing us, right? What's possible for us, and how can we move forward in that way, right? Because this is the affiliative and alignment process through capital. Well, that's not something I can immediately change because it's producing me. I have to, and this will be when we get in chapter 4. How do we create revolutionary investments, right? How do we start doing something about that?
So let's take a break now. We've hit the first hour. Up till now, we're starting to get closer to the middle of this section, and I'd love to open it up for questions or thoughts or anything we've discussed so far, or questions of upcoming. Please, anyone, we're open. You can type it. You can say it. You can whisper it softly. I don't know. But we're open. I'd love to hear any questions, any thoughts, any questions at this point. Come on. Come on. Looks like Sven is typing. Excellent. I'm happy to sit in a very awkward silence, very long time. Sven asks, has this mode of production through changing desires been developed in the past century, or does it extend further back in history? So pieces of it extend further back in history. They talk at length about that. The challenge here that is newer, I don't know if I'd say past century, but because we're now in 2021, but like 150 years, Marx, the be I would say before Marx or after Marx, kind of as a way to think through it. But the shift in capital is this change at the conjunction of where the subject begins having these things coded and where these things start becoming completely, sort of free value that's able to move and become whatever it needs to be. That shift that happens almost one step removed from the subject is a thing that's very new. And a lot of it has necessitated, private property, as an example, is necessary for this. You can't really get away with public property or non-commodified goods or, full, 100% employment, whatever it may be, these elements. It's a lot more challenging, we'll say, without those elements. Underneath it all, you have this way that my production, the way that I'm paid and the way that production is organized is able to itself become value. The thing that tells me what I need to make is no longer I need to make child to marry off, or the despot has ordered that my area produce 500 bits of gold, or bushels of apples, or whatever it may be, an edict from on high. Instead, it's a very abstracted edict that's done through capital and this value system that's telling me what I need to do for work. If there is an alienation as I see it, and maybe Jack will disagree with this, it's the fact that I no longer really have, or I almost yearn for, a desire that can be told to me or orders of it. We'll be getting into this a lot more very shortly, but there is a loss in telling me what to do, that my actions have direct values, that I'm able to see the impact they have on the world. I can't. I've been very proud of the work I've done in the companies I've worked with and the people I've worked with, but at no point has it ever yielded a thing. Like, it's not like we built something that the world will see forever. Everything's ephemeral. Everything's mutated into something else. This shift, this way that everything becomes deeply abstracted on the other side of production, on the other side of my work, is the thing that they're talking about, this conjunction. And so that's unique, and it requires industrial capital and the way that it's broken down to operate. But I'd be open to anyone else wanting to answer for sure.
Weren't you involved with the production of Skynet?
No. Terminator was before my time. Jack, any thoughts on what I just said, or am I generally yes? Ben, anyone?
Well, I mean, this is like the question of co-option or authenticity, right? In the same way, I think alienation under processes of deterritorialization and reterritorialization, it becomes difficult at least to maintain the traditional definitions. Like I said earlier, if we're talking about alienation from the real man, disadulation of the real man and his laboring in that, and his product of labor, I don't think that that's going to be I just don't think that'll be sustainable here. But I do think that there is a subjectivity there, which I can see in what you're saying, my dear friend, that is actually tenable, right? There is a subjectivity, I think you're putting your finger on, that is being produced, right? Because I hear so that's what it was and all of that. And that is, I think, the point, that there is when we say the I feel, right? That is being produced, and that is real. Maybe it's not at the states of alienation in that, and maybe that's for the better. But nonetheless, there is that point about the I feel being not only produced, but taking place.
And I think it's okay. Then I think we move a little bit further. As we start talking about the values of code, the surplus values of code, and the flux of them, to quote 232 bottom, in defining pre-capitalist regimes by a surplus value of code in capitalism by a generalized decoding that converted this surplus value of code into a surplus value of flux, we were presenting things in a summary fashion. We were still acting as though the matter were settled once and for all at the dawn of a capitalism that had lost all code value. This is not the case, however. On the one hand, codes continue to exist, even as an archaism, but they assume a function that is perfectly contemporary and adapted into the situation within personified capital, the capitalist, the worker, the merchant, the banker. But on the other hand, and more profoundly, every technical machine presupposes flows of a particular type, flows of code, that are both interior and exterior to the machine, forming the elements of a technology and even a science. It is these flows of code that find themselves encasted, coded, or overcoded in the pre-capitalist societies in such a way that they never achieve any independence, the blacksmith or the astronomer. But the decoding of flows in capitalism is freed, deterritorialized and decoded the flows of code just as it has the others, to such a degree that the automatic machine has always increasingly internalized them in its body, or its structure, as a field of forces, while depending on a science and a technology, on a so-called intellectual labor, distinct from the manual labor of the worker, the evolution of the technical object. In this sense, it is not machines that have created capitalism, but capitalism that creates machines, that is constantly introducing breaks and cleavages through which it revolutionizes its technical modes of production. This last little bit, I'm loath to bring up anything Nick Land writes, but if you're wondering where Nick Land sort of branches off, this is one of those paragraphs that he very much runs with. And a lot of his work and writing, I think, is very interesting in this direction, this idea of capitalism being an organization of technical machines towards a singularity of sorts. The accelerationist mentality there. I disagree with it for a whole bunch of things that come through the rest of the section and the rest of the book, but and the rest of their other writing and other things. But this is the response here isn't, again, to this sort of outmoded belief, they say, that the machines, the automation is the thing that produced capitalism. It's very much a thing I know I was taught in high school and junior high through a history of time, that, oh, this automation, suddenly we were able to do these wonderful things, and the cotton gin, like all these fucking stories. But this is not how that works as they talk through here. They instead talk about how actually, no, it's capitalism that builds these machines. The social machines and the setup build the technical objects that shift the manual labor of the worker, creating a secondary class of science and technology, those intellectual laborers that move things significantly. And as they move through and they start talking about the shift that they're making here, I really love the next paragraph. Before I move on, any questions, thoughts so far on what I'm talking about? Jack, anyone?
Yeah, I would actually elevate the stakes there, right? So, like, to your point, yes, the machines have produced capitalism. Now let's take that even further and put that into the syntheses. So it's not that the machines have produced the socius here. It's that the socius is producing the machines. The actual processes of production and differentiation, right? Those are actually based on a condition of capital as socius. And I think that's a really interesting, it's a repetition of their point, but I think it puts it very nicely, because we are talking about now the second great deterritorialization, and this point about it's not as though everything's decoded. Recoding and reterritorialization are happening. And I like that they're reminding us of this point, even though it's a repetition. I like that they're doing that, because what they're basically getting at here is, right, the processes of coordination and recording in that, right, the way things come together, develop their relationships, do what they're going to do, and provide a subjectivity and a memory of that. It's not as though the machines made that happen. It's that capital is the condition for that, which is ultimately, right, that's just reaffirming its place as socius. Which I think is part of McClann's point, right? Because he has to deal with everything through the condition of capitalist socius. So, like when he writes from the perspective of robots and that, or AI, that is one of the points I think he's trying to make, is that that is also AI under this condition.
Well, then I'll continue moving forward. The line in the next paragraph, to come back towards what we were talking about earlier, which is the subject at the center. I'll just read the beginning of the paragraph again. Thus, the importance of human surplus value remains decisive, even at the center and in highly industrialized sectors. What determines the lowering of costs and the elevation of the rate of profit through machinic surplus value is not innovation itself, whose value is no more measurable than that of human surplus value. It is not even the profitability of the new technique considered in isolation, but its effect on the overall profitability of the firm in its relationships with the market and with commercial and financial capital. Again, a different way of talking about a great deal of this. It's one of the things that it makes it difficult once you've started to go down this line to actually have discussions in leftist circles meaningfully. I tend to agree greatly with this and some of the work that's been done since. I find it brilliant. But it's this shift in thinking through this. Normatic asks, if it comes up further in the reading, hear more about the genetic code, its relation to differential calculus. How does it replace belief systems and make schizophrenia? Well, there's a lot asked there. Normatic. It won't. I don't think it's going to be coming up here. It will be later. It's a little bit ways down the line when they start getting more into the potentialities of capitalist representation. But I think an early version of it, I could say, and Jack, Ken, Ben, anyone jump in and disagree. The decoded flows that's done in the economic side of capitalism is interesting because it breaks things. And it decodes them and allows the flows to flow as they do. It allows connections to be made and allows things to be done that may not be done otherwise if things were hyper rigid and hyper codified as a system. Because of the way that the differential calculus works, and we have this really weird system of let me go back up so I can make sure I get the math I don't fully grasp fully. It's a curve without a tangent. The direction it is apt to take in economy as well as linguistics. Quote, if the movement does not tend toward any limit, if the quotient of differentials is not calculable, the present no longer has meaning. The quotient of differentials is not resolved. The differences no longer cancel one another in their relationship. No limit opposes the break or the breaking of this break. The tendency finds no end. The thing in motion never quite reaches what the immediate future has in store for it. It is endlessly delayed by accidents and deviations. Such is the complex notion of a continuity within the absolute break. End quote. And as they say, in the expanded immanence of the system, the limit tends to reconstitute in its displacement the thing it tended to diminish in its primitive emplacement. Jack, if you want to talk, you can. You don't have to type it.
Were we talking about the limit just now?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Then yeah, I can tie these 2 points together. So there's normatic subject rights. If it comes up in the further reading, I would like to hear more about the genetic code and its relation to differential calculus. How does it replace belief systems and schizophrenia? So tying that into what we were just talking about with the limits, right? So this is one of the big things with capitalist socios is the displacement of the limit. This is interesting to work out right now because we're talking about that relation to the third synthesis, the way in which the conjunct, not that we're excluding the other two syntheses, we're just going to take a liberty to make a point and then just do a little focused analysis for a minute, the way in which the conjunct in relation to this limit is experiencing this displacement, right? And we're seeing how through processes of reterritorialization, the actual limit of production, if you like, is being constantly displaced and reconstituted. And this is the point about a break with a break, right? The limit is, almost want to do the Mean Girls, the limit doesn't exist, but that's not what it is, right? The limit is approached, reconstituted, and so what you have in production is you have, right, the flow is hitting a break, and then with the new constitution of the limit, you have the process of production now experiencing a second break because things have been reconstituted, reconfigured, and that's part of this limit reconfiguration. If we tie it back to the concern for differential calculus and genetic code, one of the things we can work out here, right, so I took this to the primitive with germinal flux, even though that's really more of a concern for representation during the first socius. If we just focus on it insofar as we're talking about production and reproduction, right, which is ultimately what they're understanding unconscious as in terms of sexuality, right, not non-anthropomorphic production and reproduction. We're talking about how things are being produced and reproduced, and in that sense, right, how production is actually itself being produced and now being reproduced through the reconstitution of a limit. And that's where I think you're getting a lot of the reterritorialization effects, right? Because in that reconstitution, in that reproduction, right, there's something of a discontinuity because things are being reconfigured and you have this break with a break.
And we will be for sure getting into that in the next section as we get through representation, because, you know, ultimately at the very end of all of this, as we start talking, the subject, the way that repression happens, the way that really all of this ultimately works is it comes down to, once again, the family. There's a reason the book's called Anti-Oedipus, and the shift over time through this, as we're talking about. Again, well, we could talk a little bit about it now, I think, because the way that in the previous sociuses, I was able to find reasons to not have incest, for example. There were reasons, imminent reasons. My daughter or my sister or my mother, they're actually ways that we have our alliant grown out, or they birth children, which gives me a filial line. I'm actually literally giving birth to the things that help enrich me and keep my group alive, my family alive. With the despotic, things get a little bit more gummed up, but there's still like a direct line and setup that kind of is prohibitive about the nature. But as we move, the way that the nuclear family operates under capital is the formation of this subject and sexual reproduction being placed inside of this very, very tight representation of the family. So it's really important. We're not quite, I think, at the point to talk about reproduction. Your next question, I kind of that's where my brain went to. Sexual reproduction, Normatic asks, genetic code, sustaining life form, gets transformed into market reproduction. No. Yes. It's capital at this point is now delegating the formation of the subjects to the family. The family is the one who's got the job to do this, because social production and social reproduction, which is through commercial trade alliances and financial debt affiliations, have been overcome incredibly by capital as this socius. And so because of this, human reproduction for the first time has been separated completely from social production and reproduction. This is a whole different thing. Human reproduction is privatized for the first time. And this happens under capital, and it's kind of a major shift as we get going. We're not quite there yet, because I think it's worth reading that entire section before we dive into it. But at this point, we're starting to have that discussion where we're talking about the portrait of the scientific and technical worker, the shift in people making machines, why people make machines, capital ultimately building these technical objects and technical machines that create, some level of value, but it's really the labor of the person who made it who makes the surplus value. And suddenly we're divorced from that even further and further and further. The joke being a person who coded Facebook, for example, their labor is spread out so deeply and the machine's sort of ongoing, creating its own now that it's automated. At what point is there human surplus capital that's in that? And the answer is everywhere, throughout every interaction of it. The coder replicated their own labor in a thing that drives further value growth in that really fucked up capital curve that is now part of that in ununderstandable calculus of the nightmare of all of it. And it's this whole other thing that shifts, and this is one of the things that happens, as I think is another important thrust of this entire section. The push as we do this, and as these moments exist, now we're divorced from the value we're creating, but value is so interconnected, like across all of it, that suddenly there is no way for us to do a thing that isn't part of what is that larger industrial, military, oppressive machine. I think they have another thing that they add to it, like their quote, "So interdependent are the various sectors and branches of the economy that nearly everyone is involved in one way or another in anti-human activities. The farmer supplies food to troops fighting in Vietnam. The tool and die makers turning out the intricate machinery needed for a new automobile. The manufacturers of paper and ink and TV set on whose products are used to control the minds of people," and so on, and so on, and so on. None of us are not part of this. Everyone who contributes at all to the capitalist society, which is everyone really, you are part of this. There is no way to divorce your capital in your small corner of a co-op from the entirety of the capitalist machine. And it's one of the powers of the capitalist machine that does this. Sven asks, some thoughts. Code is a kind of multiplication, so is capital, while labor is addition. I can say, so the way that they describe it, and I think that's a fair way to put it, I'm going to say it a slightly different way and tell me if you agree, Sven. Code and capital, and specifically industrial capital, are worthless on their own. Labor is the addition of a positive element, an element that exists that gets transformed or decoded into capital, and through that it is multiplied. They use the phrase that capital is dead labor, almost vampiric, I think is the term they use. And as it's vampiric, it has nothing itself if it can't feed on labor. So capital will come along. The example I used during our discussion, I think, is valuable here. I decide to open a restaurant. I'm working myself. That's great. At some point, I take my labor excess, the capital that I've earned, that I have extra on top of rent and food costs and the sheer costs of running the business. There's excess there. I use that to hire you, Sven. That capital that I'm now paying you is effectively dead. It's not like it's growing anymore. I've turned it into you and your labor. And it's been sort of coded in that way. But as you work, it becomes once again decoded into now capital. And this excess that now exists, I can put into hiring 10, 20, 30 more people, opening a ton of places. But as I do that, it's not producing at any point until I actually have labor to insert it into. If I can't flow my capital through labor, then it's dead. It does nothing. It can't grow. But as soon as I do, it multiplies and grows massively. And there's a lot of very good examples, I think, of that within our system. Does that make sense, Sven? That's a really good thought. I like the way you put it. Hopefully I said it okay. So the second part of this paragraph I want to make sure we also get into, which is, it's at top of 239. They have the three segments of the ever-widening capitalist reproduction process that become joined. These three aspects also define the three aspects of its immanence. To go through sort of the three, and I think we'll get to the conjunctive pretty quick. We have the first, which is the one that extracts her human surplus value on the basis of the differential relation between decoded flows of labor and production, and that moves from the center to the periphery, while nevertheless maintaining vast residual zones at the center. Two, the one that extracts machinic surplus value on the basis of an axiomatic of the flows of scientific and technical code in the core areas of the center. And three, the one that absorbs or realizes these two forms of surplus value of flux by guaranteeing the emission of both and by constantly injecting anti-production into the producing apparatus. Schizophrenization occurs on the periphery, but it occurs at the center and the core as well. There's a nature to all of this, that this abstraction of capital that's continually moving and changing, that's setting these things up, does have a schizophrenization. So to go back a little bit, I think, to normatic subjects' point, there is a level that happens. It happens at the periphery, but occurs at the center and the core as well, because these two forms of surplus value of flux are guaranteed emission and constantly injecting anti-production into producing apparatus. It's constantly breaking. It's constantly giving us new ways of connecting and doing stuff, is how I read that. Jack, Ben, Ken, anyone else read it differently? Or did I just ramble too long and now everyone's lost?
Did you say the passage is 239?
Well, yes, the top of 239. I can share my screen as well. Sharing my screen.
Yeah, sorry, it just started storming where I'm at, so I'm hoping I don't lose connection.
No, you're fine.
That's your 239?
Yes.
Oh, well, this would explain it. I have a different 239.
Oh, well, I don't know what to tell you about that.
Yeah, mine, and that would explain the confusion. Mine, top of 239, the penguin is relative dependence of the industrial
Penguin.
capitalist.
Yeah, Penguin's different. Sorry. I'm in the Minnesota Press.
That's okay. That's okay. That's probably a better edition, but that means that would explain why I was like, I don't know where he's getting this from. Not my 239.
I'll give you a second, Jack. If anyone else wants to jump in, please. Anyone can talk. If you can't unmute yourself, please mention in the Anti-Oedipus chat. I will happily unmute you, and you can comment away as you wish. Also, our one viewer on YouTube, hello. You can also comment. I'm watching the comments there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I won't. I'm not going to waste time just trying to flip through and land like a dart on a bullseye, because I've never been good at darts. But yeah, I mean, so the first big move is to understand that when they say capitalist production and reproduction, right, they're talking about, because we're talking about capital associates, we're not talking about like a biological or per se a market productivity. We're talking about the unconscious in its production, right, which is a self-production, and therefore it's producing and being reproduced. Right, so this point about capitalist reproduction processes, and this is kind of, maybe a vexing point, but we're getting at how the unconscious is actually being produced and reproduced here, right? And these three segments, I think, are quite nice. The abstraction, well, quite nice from an explanatory standpoint, right? Because it's giving us the immanence of capital associates, right? Value on the basis of differential relation between decoded flows of labor and production, and that moves from the center to the periphery while nevertheless maintaining vast residual.
I think, Jack, you cut out. Just letting you know.
But yeah, just in that first one, I'll point out that I like that they're drawing out a process of territorialization, right? The way in which zones are being constituted for which the subject will actually pass through in its subjectivity. And part of that will be an abstraction, right?
Well, it's the second half of that is also a change in what surplus value is. And I think that's the next paragraph. I want to just read a little bit. The definition of surplus value must be modified in terms of the machinic surplus value of constant capital, which distinguishes itself from the human surplus value of variable capital and from the non-measurable nature of this aggregate of surplus value of flux. It cannot be defined by the difference between the value of labor capacity and the value created by labor capacity, but by the incommensurability between two flows that are nonetheless immanent to each other, by the disparity between the two aspects of money that express them, and by the absence of a limit exterior to their relationship, the one measuring the true economic force, the other measuring a purchasing power determined as income. The first is the immense deterritorialized flow that constitutes the full body of capital. An economist of the caliber of Bernard Schmidt finds strange lyrical words to characterize the flow of infinite debt, an instantaneous creative flow that the banks create spontaneously as a debt owing to themselves, a creation ex nihilo that, instead of transferring a pre-existing currency as means of payment, hollows out at one extreme of the full body a negative money debt entered as a liability to the banks, and projects at the other extreme a positive money, a credit guaranteed the productive economy by the banks, a flow possessing a power of mutation that does not enter into income and is not assigned to purchases, a pure availability, non-possession, non-wealth. This section right here, as we talk about this is a complete shift in my understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about surplus value as a thing and the nature of it, at least in a lot of the discussions I've seen or been a part of. I know I'm not sort of as well read as many, but this shift of the surplus value that's created, it isn't just, oh, pardon me, I've got a thing in my throat. Someone talk. I'm going to have to get water. Oh, that was miserable. It's not simply a surplus value of, on one side, we have the employee who does X work, and then we have a surplus value that's created, and that's labor. This is not simple as that. It's that mixed with the incommensurability of it, its relation to it. This is why his appeal happens to calculus in this, and that we have the dx over dy, that it's not simply this addition added, or even maybe a multiplication, but an exponentialization of the entire thing. This variability isn't standard, it isn't simplistic, it isn't just a little bit extra. The change is actually the point. The growth is actually the point. The mass shift is actually the underlying way that these things are valued. To go back to Tesla, which is always my favorite example, almost across capital. We could also use WeWork, which is another great one. There is no surplus value that makes sense for them. It isn't a surplus value per se that is making Tesla worth what it is, or made WeWork worth $42 billion, or some insane number. The thing that did that was the differential that he's talking about here. It's not simply that WeWork it didn't have actually excess capital at all, but it had some level of constant capital, some level of variable capital, but between the two and their deltas and the way that they play with each other is actually this underlying thing that capital plays with, that is the immense deterritorialized flow that actually is the full body of capital, this massive change between on the one side, the true economic force, and the other, purchasing power as income. Those two and their delta is the underlying surplus value that he's referring to here. And it's a hell of a shift. It's a hell of a shift. And it's a lot of change. Normatic asks, technical code is connected to paranoia, right? My immediate response would be yes, in the sense that capital is the thing that demands the technical codes be created. Not like an AI devising it or some kind of all-encompassing being, but the nature of the machine is always pushing towards technical objects and technical machines being made in order to allow further exploitation, further deltas in between the two limits. And so this odd kind of secondary labor, the technical labor that's created, tends to be in line with paranoia because of that, because it's being built by the machine. That'd be my response. But other people may have different ones. Anyone want to step in, chat a little bit? Okay. I will continue. This delta being the nature of surplus capital is a way, as they call it, for an incompetent observer to say that this schema, this entire view, is profoundly schizophrenic. Again, as I said earlier, there are chapters, there's little bits and lines in here that made me think differently about whether or not capitalism is necessarily schizophrenic. For sure, this feels like they're pointing at that as an answer, but it feels like that because no one at any point sort of occupies a singular point, everything being decoded. Their line that they have here, this theory, this setup, who is robbed is the serious implied question that echoes Clavel's ironic question, who is alienated? Yet no one is or can be robbed, just as according to Gavel, one no longer knows who is alienated or who does the alienating. Who steals? Not the finance capitalist or the representative of the great instantaneous creative flow, which is not even a possession and has no purchasing power. The The capitalist just has all this money in the bank. It's on a ledger. How is he possibly stealing your paycheck? Who is robbed? Well, not the worker, who's not even bought, since the reflex or salary distribution creates purchasing power instead of presupposing it. Who would be capable of stealing? Certainly not an industrial capitalist as the representative of the afflux of profit, since profits do not flow in the reflux, but side by side with, deviating from rather than penalizing the flow that creates incomes. Oh my, how much flexibility there is in the axiomatic of capitalism, always ready to widen its own limits so as to add a new axiom in the previously saturated system. Please try now. You should be able to unmute yourself in theory. I think you've self-muted.
Oh, thank you. It works.
Yeah, there you go. Did you have something to say, or just wanted to make sure your push to talk's working?
No, really, no.
Okay, cool.
I'm just listening to it.
Cool. The line here I really love is that it's how much flexibility there is in the axiomatic of capitalism, always ready to widen its own limits to add a new axiom to a previously saturated system. An axiom for wage earners, the working class, and unions. This shift and change, and Marx alluding to the golden age of the capitalist, when the capitalist didn't even hide his own cynicism. Once upon a time, he could not be unaware of what he was doing, but this cynicism has grown to the point where he's able to declare no one at all is being robbed. This shift and this change, this shift in how we talk about the flows, the way that these things operate, this underlying layer of how things sort of make their way out to, let's say, the common man and not the capitalist, is the thrust of this section, with the final line being, this is money and market, capitalism's true police. A flow made impotent that represents the absolute impotence of the wage earner as well as the relative dependent of the industrial capitalist. The nature of connecting us to what we can actually buy, the actual purchasing power, buying a house, even if it's a $30 million yacht or whatever it is, there is constraints put on it, and the market and money that concretizes this, free-flowing, crazy capital thing that ultimately is if there is a chains or a thing that we are locked down by inside of this system, it is this nature of the money in the market, where the flows are hardened, made impotent, made specific, turned into, as they call, derisively named purchasing power, which is a hell of a sentence too. This setup is the reason that we're able to have the rest of this. We may have these free-flowing schizophrenic flows at the top of capital, but underneath it all is this deep, hard constraints of the market and money and how these things work. Is how I read this paragraph. This is maybe not for everyone. I don't know if everyone, there's a few secondary sources I know that disagree, so don't take it for my word. But the underlying thing I think is pretty fair. If anyone wants to chat or add to that, please, I'm open. All right, then I'll just read a handful of bits, I think, as we keep going. The next paragraph, I like the beginning. In a certain sense, capitalist economists are not mistaken when they present the economy as being perpetually in need of monetarization, as if it were always necessary to inject money into the economy from the outside according to a supply and a demand. In this manner, the system indeed holds together and functions and perpetually fulfills its own immanence. In this manner, it is indeed the global object of an investment of desire, the wage earner's desire, the capitalist's desire. Everything moves to the rhythm of one and the same desire, founded on the differential relation of flows, having no assignable exterior limit, and where capitalism reproduces its immanent limits on an ever-widening and more comprehensive scale. Wonderful piece, actually. Wonderful quote. Oh, 61, it's good to see you. Yes. 61 says hello and then fell over, I'm guessing.
Oh, hello. Sorry.
No, there you are. Just sounded like a
I'm
collapse.
here. No, it was more of a stutter, but yes. Sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're fine. You're not interrupting. We're kind of winding down and finishing out 3.9. So the question that they present now is this line, how does one come to desire strength while also desiring one's own impotence? This is hearkening back to the why do men desire their own repression from Reich. How was such a social field able to be invested by desire, and how far does desire go beyond so-called objective interests when it is a question of flows set in motion and to break? Doubtless Marxists will remind us that the formation of money as a specific relation within capitalism depends on the mode of production that makes the economy a monetary economy. But the fact remains that the apparent objective movement of capital, which is by no means a failure to recognize or an illusion of consciousness, shows that the productive essence of capitalism can itself function only in this necessarily monetary or commodity form that cajoles it, and whose flows and relations between flows contain the secret of the investment of desire. It is at the level of flows, the monetary flows included, and not at the level of ideology, that the integration of desire is achieved. The subject being the thing that they're pointing at here, the level of flows, monetary flows included, not at ideology, that integration of desire is achieved. And then I'll just read the last paragraph and then we'll open it up for questions. So what is the solution? Which is the revolutionary path? Psychoanalysis is of little help, entertaining as it does the most intimate of relations with money and recording, while refusing to recognize it, an entire system of economic monetary dependencies at the heart of the desire of every subject it treats. Psychoanalysis constitutes, for its part, a gigantic enterprise of absorption of surplus value. But which is the revolutionary path? Is there one? To withdraw from the world market, as Samir Amin advises third world countries to do in a curious revival of the fascist economic solution? Or might it be to go in the opposite direction? To go still further, that is, in the movement of the market of decoding and deterritorialization. For perhaps the flows are not yet deterritorialized enough, not decoded enough from the viewpoint of a theory and a practice of a highly schizophrenic character. Not to withdraw from the process, but to go further, to accelerate the process, as Nietzsche put it. In this matter, the truth is that we haven't seen anything yet. It's a wonderful ending to that as well. And I leave it open for any questions, please. I'll avoid giving analysis on this last bit. Sorry. Please, Ken, go ahead.
1 second. My dog's going to bark whenever I step outside. 1 second. So, I got the same feeling twice while you were reading. Earlier, whenever you were talking about the dy dx and the delta and all of that, and it sounds like they're making the argument that it doesn't necessarily make sense to differentiate between like people who own or control capital and then people who are alienated, which makes sense at like a macro level, but at a micro level, your day in and day out at work, you find yourself under like certain kinds of managers, and just the fact that there's like different kinds of managers mean that your job's going to suck, more or less depending on the kind of manager, you know what I mean? That's one thing. Like I've had to watch my partner fight for a higher raise in one job because their manager was a certain way, not because they didn't have access to the resources, and then it not be such a problem in another job. So that was the first time that I got this feeling, and then um, and the second time was like the feeling that things are looked at on this like huge macro, I guess it's this body without organs scale, which is odd because that's also supposed to be the micro, right? So now I'm forgetting what you said at the end there that made me think
so
about it a second time.
let's go with the second thing, because I think I would see it as this macro view that you're talking about is when we're talking about the two regimes, as they've gotten into the molar and the molecular, we're not talking about two separate worlds. They're almost a mirror of each other to me. Granted, they get significantly larger on one side, but there is a sort of, I don't know, to me, a natural sense of, from the position of the subject going out, there's a growth, a splintering to where we have our socius, or our body without organs, sort of on opposing sides of the creation of the subject, the way that it's running. And while it may be gigantically macro, these flows feel more in line with the flows of a desiring machine pre-BWO, or I guess on the other side, pre-socius or post-socius. So it feels in line with me, but I get what you're saying. And that's to the other one.
I just remembered the start of control.
No, please go.
No, please finish your thought. I just remembered the other thing based off what you were just talking about.
Well, and the other part is the bargaining for purchasing power. And it's one of the things that people make the mistake of is sharing as a, I go in and I bargain for capital. My boss, they make, as a company, they're worth $30 billion. Why can't you just distribute that to all of the people within it? The purchasing power is not the same thing as a market cap, for example, which is more what capital plays with. The functions of them are drastically different. What they enable are incredibly different things. So as such, it's really difficult when you're going in for talking about arrays or having that conversation. I remember I've had jobs where they do the review thing, and every year you get 1 to 5 as a score, and if you get a 5, you get a 4% raise, all the way down to, like, if you get a 1, you get no raise. And it's just this automated, weird, like 6-level bureaucracy system, which I always thought hilarious at a company that prides itself on being hyper creative, Lucasfilm. And so you have these really weird situations of people bargaining for capital and companies that are making massive amounts of capital. But I think a lot of what he's talking about here is that they're not the same thing, that purchasing power is this yoke, this chain of what we're assigning as a value at the very end of the life almost of capital, when we harden it, rather than the very free-flowing way capital can operate itself.
Okay. Yeah, that's something I would need to think a lot more about. The second thing was, it's saying it's not ideology, it's these flows, and I guess that just connects on to what you were just saying a second ago. But I've read and listened to a lot of critiques of, like, using ideology as a way of describing and predicting this stuff, and it makes sense. Like, I don't think everything should be reduced down to ideology, or that ideology is even necessarily a useful way of talking about whatever that's trying to point at. But it definitely seems, and maybe the hard thing I'm trying to get my head around here is that the subject is produced after the fact. But it seems like people's worldviews do play a significant part into their actions, like, after the fact. Like, they're primed by their ideologies, if you will, to filter information and to make specific choices versus other choices, right? So I don't see how whatever good sense there is to ideology, or common sense or whatever, can be completely eschewed. Does that make sense? See where I'm going?
Yeah, no. Well, so it's the idea of ideology here. I have a feeling, just because that's just generally the case in here, that this is Guattari aiming squarely at Lacan, or his contemporaries around that. And I think when we talk about sort of, and the thousand ways we can talk about Lacanian ideology, the people who've taken it on since this, Zizek, I think, for example, has done exceptional work in ideology sense. But I think very specifically, this idea of there being a layer, an ideology that is a veil that we see things through, versus talking about the actual production of desires pre-subject. They're very different things. We can talk about that the pre-subject is crafted in a very specific way, and that through that there's a level of ideology that's formed. And I think that would be a discussion. I think there's some arguments to be made. I think that, I mean, for me, I see them as closer to that. Even how Zizek or Lacan write about it, it's not really a veil that we see things through, even though Zizek uses that fucking sunglasses analogy so fucking much. That it's much more, my desires are produced, and then suddenly I'm on the other side and I go, oh, that's who I am. That's what I wanted. And the thing that exists before that, the body without organs, is essentially that ideology that we may want to talk about. That, I think there's some stuff to be done there, but the idea of ideology here is really at aim, and again, you know more about Lacan than I do. I think it's aiming more at this idea that it's a post-subject ideology, that there's this beyond the unconscious, that there is an ideology that exists I'm seeing the world through, and through that, the integration of desire is achieved. Their argument is saying, no, it's actually the level of flows. And that includes monetary desires. It's beneath the subject, beneath the concretization of things. This is where we have it, not at ideology, which is kind of a post hoc or post-subject thing.
I mean, yeah, I get that. And it's almost like I want to conflate ideology with the repressive representation, the repressive representative, right? Because it's these representations that sort of fix or crush desiring flows, right? And that might happen like post hoc, right? But then that like retroactively informs those flows, if you will. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, the entire next section is about capitalist representation, where I think their critique of this comes in a lot stronger and a lot more specific to what you're talking about. But this cynicism, I think they even called it here, and they'll continue to, is this idea with cynicism mixed with, I think, asceticism or piety, where people continue to pretend to believe in progress, the end of history, the good of America, the whatever. And the reality is there's no need for any of these things within capital. These things don't necessarily exist. Cynicism and, to quote Holland, cynicism and piety express the two moments of the capitalist form of coding, decoding and recoding, which in turn correspond to the two moments comprising the rhythm of capitalist axiomatization, deterritorialization and reterritorialization. And they're pushed towards this different format when it comes to the representation of sort of nature of this is, I think, going to be a lot of a larger and I think more comprehensive critique of ideology that, again, I don't think necessarily goes against anything that Lacan or Zizek even talk about. I think it's just placing it in a different spot so we can understand it more from a, here are the ins and outs from the machine kind of thing, if that makes sense. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does. Yeah, it definitely did.
Okay. Yeah, it's a tough one.
Hello?
Hey, please, Rishix. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing
just
that.
Rishi works. Yeah.
Rishi, please.
This is my first time on the server and probably talking to people who might know Deleuze better than I do. I mean, like in the sense that, you know, people are more read. But I guess I'm gonna take this moment to kind of gauge certain ideas I've been having about, I mean, back on what you guys were talking about in terms of what are the ideologies that would allow you to deterritorialize with the intent of spreading those ideologies in the first place, maybe sort of like strategies that emerge with the material condition of things. And I've been working with like a bunch of people who are in the blockchain space, holochain and all of that kind of stuff, and we are working on essentially seeing what can happen beyond like the body of money that we are used to and know about in terms of pure quantitative measurement as opposed to something that could measure direction or have a memory of intent to channel capital maybe with direction and intentionality and all of those kind of things. And I'm trying to like figure out what are the ideologies that's emerging within us. Like, you know, if Lacan can be thought of as an ideology that permits maybe, you know, living under a capitalist system and all of that stuff. When you do have to like deterritorialize and you have to do it carefully, what are the point of like, let's say, the ideologies that come from maybe something like Arthur Kessler's holons and holarchic management, if we have to go back to that, where it's about going out of the idea of like a hierarchy into something that's more, you know, akashic record or plane of imminence kind of stuff. And there's a lot of overlap between holons, the idea of holons, and spiral dynamics, where you think of all these sort of organizing codes that may help, and seeing in an accelerationist point of view how these codes are kind of required for acceleration. I mean, in the process of deterritorializing. And I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but I'm just trying to like gauge where can be or what is a vision for like ideologies that might emerge out of the future of changing how the body of money might work in its fundamental physics.
Yeah, I mean, we're sort of going to be hitting that for sure next week with the way that representation works within capital and how capital plays, because the thing we've moved through here is literally how production operates and the sort of the body of organization at a core level works. The nature of how production and anti-production are made within a capitalist society is necessarily dependent on the delta between all of these different flows as the way that they describe it. They will be getting deeper into the inscription, capitalist inscription, and how money and capital specifically inscribe and write upon the socius what they mean or how they work. And ultimately, it works through some very sort of light things. It is, on the one hand, the nature of the axiomatic, and then also through sort of this sort of secondary edge of writing and rewriting of the deterritorialization / reterritorialization. I'm hesitant to say that there is a such thing, by the way, as simple deterritorialization. It's one of those things that as a thing is deterritorialized, imminent to that is the reterritorialization sort of chasing right behind it. If we think of a shift from blue to red, there may be a gradient between, but there is that constant shift in the horizon with one chasing the other. They happen imminent to each other. Within capital, the nature of how the representation works or plays enables this sort of exceptional way for people to believe in these grand narratives, do what they need to do, and ultimately still have this form of decoding and recording, which in turn corresponds to this deterritorialization, reterritorialization, as I was talking about it. Now, there is, within decoding, there is a positive moment of axiomatization, because an axiomatization frees desire ultimately from sort of its own codification, which is an interesting way to sort of think through again the process of this entire thing. But at the same time of that, because we have this sort of power component of how money is distributed and purchasing power and these other elements, this freed energy that gets made gets pushed right back into these bullshit codes of the magic of the market, the invisible hand, or the good of the country, or these other things that sort of get pushed back into it. This opposition here that plays is a significant problem within Capital. I haven't read significant work, to answer your final question, I haven't read significant work where people talk through, sort of what may come next. It's one of the concepts that I actually like from Mark Fisher, the idea of acid communism, that essentially to figure out what comes next, we would have to completely mix and have a completely broken view of things, that from our position, it's almost impossible for us to have a rational discussion about what may come next, in the same way that someone in the despotic times couldn't even grasp the idea of a money that demands what we do and organizes things. They'd laugh if we said, yes, no, I own my house because of money, I do my job because of money. They'd just be so confused. They'd be like, whose money? Is that guy money up on the hill? Does he rule you? So I think we're in very much that same position. And I think a lot of work can be done in that direction. I haven't seen anything significant. If anyone else has, please.
Yeah, this is, I mean, the line you were taking me on is quite fascinating. And especially having to use the word bullshit, and how, like, every sort of cybernetic system would come up with its own bullshit that wasn't designed for. And the next step would be to go, one more level of imminence. I don't know if that's correct. That's
well, it's tough. So
yeah, one more level of.
I work in crypto as well, and one of the challenges with it, as well as any technology, is because I cut my teeth again in social media once upon a time, and then VR and video games and all of these things at one time or another were seen as this, oh my God, look at the crazy shit they're doing. It's a Wild West. And seen as this thing that could be, in theory, emancipatory, if you can believe it. Once upon a time, social media was seen as a way to completely challenge the structure of the world. What it's done is the absolute opposite of that. It's reinforced it par excellence in ways that I hope I don't have to go into. But I would say the same of video games. I would say the same of everything, because again, as they talk about through here, and it's hard to get away from the argument that capitalism, through engineers, through people within the system who live inside of this representation, who have this value system and who are having their desires molded by it, are the ones creating these technical machines. As we create technical machines, necessarily they're in service of capital. Now, they may not seem it at first, and it's very difficult to figure out maybe how it works. When Twitter first came out, everyone was like, well, there are no ads. Even if they ran ads, how could they possibly ever make money? There's a billion people tweeting random stupid bullshit. Well, it turns out we were wrong. They didn't really change Twitter significantly. The algorithm shifted, and now we have Twitter as we know it today. Facebook, despite being now, when I say this in retrospect, it may be absurd, but Facebook was seen as this way of, I get to fill my own brain with the information I want rather than the stuff NBC or Fox tell me. That's powerful. But then it's sort of not at all because of how it gets built and who's designing it. The technical machines aren't separate from capital, and the engineers building them are hardly separate from capital. And as such, their biases and the way that their desires are manufactured get put into it. I do generally ascribe to the theory that crypto could be a pure capital without a money component, but that's a deeply weird theoretical side to it. I'd love to have a discussion at some point. But again, to go back to the thing we kept harping on in this section, especially as we're talking about technical machines, that these things are made by capital, that capital is the reason that these things get produced. It's not that the technical machines at one point that had the the loom that automated and that enabled capitalism to exist. It's that capital, by the way that it decodes and recodes, and by the way that it has these axiomatics build, actually causes these technical machines to be built in service of it, because it shifts the labor burden from being hundreds of people with a massive strain to being a handful, but then the labor is moved into a technical white collar work that we may call, which now becomes where the pressure is placed. And these things continually shift. So there's the underlying challenge through a lot of this is talking through our current understanding of these things, where we might see them, but also understanding that we do not have the privilege of being outside of the system. So anything we see or we build is necessarily inside of it. And as such, to go back to Ken's earlier comment about where ideology comes in, this is kind of that same thing at an underlying principle. The ideology of what any one of us may feel is where we're at. And the great joke about ideology that I think I have to attribute to Zizek is, if you don't see ideology, well, that just means it's yours, which is a great line. And it means your desires are in line with that, which you're seeing. And there's a challenge with that because it's impossible to see. So, like, again, we start getting into a lot of the shifting around this. It is a thing I'd love to at some point discuss, though, because I do work in the same space and I have some of the same theories, but mostly a lot of the same worries you may hear in my voice as I talk now.
I came across this artwork where they were kind of like making the case for artist-issued currencies, as opposed to, like, let's say, the ideology that gets turned into technology by people who are already kind of embedded within the capitalist ideology system. And where I like, if we think artists as kind of like, unlocking those desires before capital gets there, and then once capital gets there, they're gonna you've got punk music or put into labels, and that propagates itself from there. But thinking of the same way, I mean, like, from the discussion that you guys were having today, I was thinking, like, if our ideologies, I mean, if according to Fisher, what he said, and how to take, I mean, like, if we have to like see the vision for the future, we have to like essentially, have our own ideologies or viewpoints as to how these things work to essentially experiment into that kind of territory. And I see a lot of the problem with like Facebook and all of those being the simple measurement systems where it's only like quantitative. You can have up and down. But if you were to look at something like how Google works, and I mean how search works in general with what do you call that, eigenvectors and complex numbers to essentially map language as a spectrum, and if maybe we can do artist issued currencies or somehow shift from the body of money to back to the body of language along with its own cybernetics, maybe. How do you think that might?
Well, and this gets into the
discussion.
The challenge with NFTs right now. Let's talk about that, because and the idea of an NFT for sale or even an artist-backed currency, when we have such a thing, we are not separated from money. Like we like to pretend we are, and we think about such a thing, but the person doing it is still needing to pay not only for their rent, but they need to pay for their retirement, and they need to pay for their medical bills in America, for example, or anything that may come. As such, the purchasing power of what they're doing is actually the number one goal that any of them have. It's core survival. So it's why we see, for example, with NFTs, if you take a look around, people say how lovely the art is. I mean, it's garbage, wall to wall. And I say this with friends who are in the space. NFT art is ugly as shit. It's meme chasing.
Yep.
It's about what is so popular that I can sell it, because if I can sell it, I can make money and I can pay my rent, because that's where that's at. A truly discursive NFT artist would not be successful. And as this sort of... Sorry, JK, go for it.
No.
Did I say something? A discursive artist, one who is not considering capital or not considering money at the very end of the exchange, one would do something drastically different than just meme chasing and trying to gain popularity. But the secondary part of it is they would not necessarily even do things towards this. Their goal is different. They're making commentary or they're trying to invert a thing. But by doing and being involved in the system, we have the chains of money at the very bottom, no matter how an artist may exist. And there are artists. Basquiat, for example, is the most prolific artist who, and granted it's after he died, made a fortune. But the art world is rife with artists who are alive and their stuff is fine. It's done quite well, but ultimately, at the very end of all of it, they're chained in some way to money, and they're chained to these other elements. And it's this chain of purchasing power is the thing that, as they say, ultimately holds not only the laborer, but also the capitalist, because at the end of the day, they're only able to do and concretize so many things as an element. It's a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
It's a challenge. And so it's like with art and any of these things in these spaces, I think there's a lot of exploration to be done, but we're still needing to be very wary of, as we dive into this space, creating multiple types of capital that are in conflict or movement, they still obey the same rules. The most valuable coins are not the ones that necessarily have actual true utility of any singular value that I can exchange one for one. That would be less capital, more money, but instead ones that are able to have the delta between what they do or what they could do and the possibility space in front of them. Those are the ones that do the best. So they operate identically to how the civilized capitalist machine works. And so we have to be very wary as we do this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. I see what you mean, and I was kind of wondering about the whole agency question, and thinking about all of these ideologies kind of limiting us, and where does, like, be it artists, where are they working from? Is there some sort of like agency that they have over the capitalist system? And if so, I mean, if that is like another part of like the body without organs expressing itself, or the Spinoza's God expressing itself, maybe capital itself can play a springboard of a role for something else. I mean, organizational codes that work right on top of it, not I mean, like as a vertical shift as opposed to anything else, for the lack of a better metaphor. But
and I think we'll come back to this.
Like,
I want to make sure
there is a luxury.
Just real quick, because this conversation is one I want to have, but I want to make sure, because we're finishing the discussion on 3.9. Is there any questions on this section before Rishux and I continue? Because you can all take off if you'd like. If anyone has any questions or thoughts, and then I can close out the recording for the section. If anyone has anything, please, 3.9. Open up. We'll get back. Don't worry, Rishux. We'll get back.
Yeah, no problem.
If there is nothing else, I will close out the recording. Thank all of you very much for joining us today. It's lovely. Next week, we will be moving on to 3.10, the story of capitalist representation, which I think, if you have time, you should join us next week, because a lot of the next section, I think, deals with a great deal of what we've been talking about just at the end here. And I thank all of you for joining. Really looking forward to them talking to you then. Thank you so much.